Eleanor Whitmore did not weep when she heard it. She pressed her back against the cold hallway wall. Fingers curled into the fabric of her skirts and breathed slow, controlled silence, while her husband's laughter drifted through the door like smoke from another life. She had stood in this house for 11 months. She had poured his coffee, she had learned his silences, and tonight she finally understood she had never once been seen. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? We want to know how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1814 came to Thornwood Hall the way it always did, heavy and golden dripping heat across the Virginia countryside like honey over a wound. The fields stretched wide and amber beyond the window glass. The horses moved slow through the morning haze, and inside the great house, Eleanor Hawthorne, née Whitmore, sat at the far end of a dining table, long enough to seat 14, eating her breakfast alone. She had been alone at that table for 11 months. She had counted. The morning began the way most mornings did at Thornwood. The housekeeper, Mrs. Draper, set Eleanor's plate without a word, poured her coffee without being asked, and disappeared back through the servant's door before Eleanor could thank her. The children of the tenant farmers would sometimes press their faces against the garden fence to watch the horses be brushed down, and their laughter carried across the yard and in through the open window. Eleanor listened to it. She ate her eggs. She did not ask where her husband was, because she already knew. Alexander Hawthorne rose before dawn. He always had. He was in the east fields by 4 in the morning, overseeing the tobacco runs. The fence repairs the slow and grinding labor of keeping a Virginian estate alive in the years after the war markets had shifted. He did not breakfast with his wife. He had not done so since the first week of their marriage, when the novelty of her presence had worn thin and the old familiar weight of his grief had settled back across his shoulders like a coat he could not take off. Eleanor had told herself in those early months that it was simply his nature, that men of his standing, men who had inherited 2,000 acres and the responsibility of 40 tenant families and a county seat, and a name that meant something in 3 counties over, such men did not have time for gentle morning conversation. She had told herself this with the calm and careful logic of a woman who had been raised to accept things. Her mother had raised her well. Too well, perhaps. She folded her napkin into a neat square and set it beside her plate. Through the window, the summer light was already climbing. Somewhere in the upper corridor, she could hear the faint sound of a door opening 2 sharp footsteps, then silence. She knew that sound. She knew every sound this house made. She had spent 11 months learning them the way a sailor learns the sounds of a ship, not out of love, but out of survival. A knock came at the dining room door. "Come in," she said. It was Thomas, the youngest of the house footmen, barely 17, with an ink smear on his left wrist, and an anxious expression he could not quite hide. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne asks that you be informed Miss Fairfax will be arriving this afternoon. He requests the blue guest room be made available." Eleanor set her coffee cup down. She did it slowly, deliberately, so that her hand would not shake. "Miss Fairfax," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Margaret Fairfax. She'll be staying through the end of August, Mr. Hawthorne says. He wanted you to know directly." Eleanor looked at the boy. He was trying very hard not to meet her eyes, and that told her everything about what the rest of the household already understood, and she had only just confirmed. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Tell Mrs. Draper to see to the room, and ask cook to prepare something appropriate for a guest's arrival." "Yes, ma'am." He was gone before she finished speaking. Eleanor sat alone in the long dining room, and the summer heat pressed in through the window, and she breathed, and she did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time. Margaret Fairfax arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon in a carriage that was too fine for a social call, and not fine enough to be a formal visit. Eleanor stood on the front steps of Thornwood Hall in her best summer muslin pale ivory high-waisted, the kind of dress that said, "I am composed, and I am watching," and she watched the carriage door open. The woman who stepped down was not what Eleanor had expected. She was not young exactly, but she had the manner of someone who had never been taught to take up less space than she wanted. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a smile that arrived a half-second too late, calculated rather than genuine, and yet so practiced it almost passed. She wore green silk in the heat of August, and did not appear to sweat at all. She looked at Eleanor the way one looks at furniture one does not remember ordering. "Mrs. Hawthorne." She extended a gloved hand. "Miss Fairfax." Eleanor took it. "Welcome to Thornwood Hall. Alexander has spoken of you." That was a lie. Alexander had spoken of almost nothing, but Eleanor had learned from letters she had not been meant to see, and conversations she had not been meant to overhear enough. She knew who Evelyn Fairfax had been. She knew what Evelyn Fairfax had been to Alexander before the fever took her 4 years ago. And she knew, standing here now with Evelyn's sister's hand in hers, exactly what this visit was meant to be. "He's spoken of me." Margaret's smile sharpened slightly at the edges. "How kind. I imagine he keeps Evelyn's memory close. They were very devoted." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I imagine they were." She stepped back and gestured toward the door. "Please, come in out of the heat." Alexander came in from the East Fields at 4:30. Eleanor heard him before she saw him. Boots on the front porch, the particular weight of his step, the sound of him handing off his hat to whichever footman happened to be nearest. She was sitting in the front parlor with her embroidery, which she had not touched when he appeared in the doorway. He was 32 years old, and he moved like a man who had never once in his life been uncertain of his right to take up space. Tall, sun-darkened from the fields, a jaw that had gone unshaven for 2 days in the way of men who have more important concerns than appearances. He saw her sitting there, and he paused a fractional pause, the barest hesitation before his expression settled back into its default calm. "Eleanor," he said. "Alexander." She set the embroidery aside. "Miss Fairfax arrived safely. I had Mrs. Draper settle her in the blue room as you requested. Cook is preparing supper for 3. He nodded. "Good." He said it the way one says it when one is relieved of a task they had not been looking forward to, the way one says it when the hired help has done their job correctly. Eleanor watched his face. "Will you be joining us for supper this evening?" Something moved behind his eyes. "I'll be there." "Good," she said, and picked her embroidery back up and did not look at him again. Supper was served at 7. The 3 of them sat at the long table, Alexander at the head, Margaret to his right, and Eleanor at the far end, where she always sat a distance of perhaps 12 feet, and an entire other world between her and her husband. Margaret spoke easily and often. She had the gift of making conversation seem effortless, pulling words from the air, like she was born to fill silence. She spoke of Baltimore. She had come from Baltimore staying with a cousin, and of the heat, and of the roads, and of a ball she had attended where someone had worn a simply atrocious shade of yellow that no woman over 30 had any business wearing. She laughed at her own stories. Alexander, Eleanor noticed, smiled at them. She had not seen him smile in 6 weeks. She ate her soup. She answered when she was addressed, which was twice: once, when Margaret asked if the summers were always this warm in Virginia, and once when Alexander asked if the linens in the blue room were acceptable. Both times she answered briefly and correctly, and both times the conversation moved on without her like a river around a stone. At the midpoint of this meal, Margaret reached across the corner of the table and touched Alexander's wrist. "Do you remember?" she said, her voice dropping into something softer, something private. "What Evelyn used to say about summer evenings. She always said the fireflies here in Virginia looked different from anywhere else." The table went very quiet. Alexander's face changed. Eleanor watched it happen, watched the careful blankness he wore like armor crack just slightly at the jaw, watched something older and rawer surface and then be pressed back down. "I remember," he said. His voice was different too, lower, like something had been set down inside it. "She loved it here." Margaret's fingers were still resting on his wrist. She used to say Thornwood was the only place she ever felt entirely, "Miss Fairfax?" Eleanor's voice came out clear and level, interrupting nothing more loudly than necessary. Both of them turned to look at her. She picked up her wine glass with a steady hand. "Would you like more wine?" A silence. "I would thank you," Margaret said, and her smile did not change. Eleanor poured it herself rather than ring for the footman. She looked at no one. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her own room separate from Alexander's, separated by a shared sitting room. They both crossed through and never occupied at the same time. And she stared at the ceiling while the summer heat pressed down on the house and the crickets screamed outside. And she tried carefully and methodically to understand what she felt. Not grief exactly. She had grieved already in pieces over the past 11 months. She had grieved the marriage she had imagined, the morning conversation, the shared evening, the gradual and patient building of something real. She had grieved the husband she had been promised, the attentive if formal man her father had described, and the early letters had hinted at. She had grieved small things, a hand she had never had reason to reach for a name, said in the dark, the way it was meant to be said. She had grieved all of that already. What she felt now was something quieter and more dangerous. She felt herself becoming certain. She had spent 11 months telling herself, be patient, be useful, be present, make yourself indispensable without making yourself a burden. Learn what he needs before he asks. Give him time. Give him space. Give him the thing that grief requires, which is the absence of expectation. She had given him all of it, and what she had received in return was a seat at the far end of a table and a husband who smiled at a dead woman's sister. Around 2 in the morning, when the house was fully quiet, she heard it. A door in the corridor. The far corridor, the one that led past the blue guest room, and then footsteps. And then a voice low and careful, and another voice lower still. Not the voice of any servant. She knew it the moment she heard it. She did not move. She lay in her bed with her eyes open and her hands flat against the coverlet, and she listened to her husband's voice murmuring through the wall of a house that was supposed to be hers. And something inside her, not her heart, something behind it, something more structural, went completely, entirely still. In the morning, she came down to breakfast earlier than usual. She was already seated, already pouring her coffee, when Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hawthorne." He hesitated. "Mr. Hawthorne asks he and Miss Fairfax will be riding out to the North Meadow this morning. He says not to hold breakfast." Eleanor looked at him. Thomas looked at the floor. "Thomas," she said very quietly. "Ma'am." "How long have you worked at Thornwood?" He blinked. 4 years, ma'am, since I was 13. "And in those 4 years," she said, "has anyone in this house ever asked you how you were getting on? Whether the work was fair? Whether you had enough to eat?" He stared at her. "I know, ma'am, not exactly." "No." She agreed. She looked down at her coffee. "Neither have I." She picked up her cup. "Tell me, Thomas, is there a physician who sees to the tenant families on the south side of the property near the creek?" He straightened slightly, surprised by the question. "Yes, ma'am, Dr. Harrington. He comes out every Thursday." "Is today Thursday?" "Yes, ma'am, it is." Eleanor set her cup down. She folded her napkin. She pushed back her chair. "Then I believe," she said, "I'll go and make myself useful." Thomas stared after her as she walked out of the dining room. Not through the front of the house, not toward the carriage, but through the kitchen door, the way the servants went, the way that came out near the garden and the tenant path, and the ordinary breathing world that had always existed just outside the edges of her life at Thornwood Hall. She did not look back. She had been invisible in this house for 11 months. It was time she decided to be seen somewhere else. The path to the tenant village was longer than Eleanor had anticipated, or perhaps it only felt that way because she had never walked it before. 11 months at Thornwood Hall, and she had never once crossed the southern field on foot. She had seen it from carriage windows. She had noted it abstractly the way one notes geography on a map, useful information, impersonal distance. Now the summer grass pulled at the hem of her skirt, and the morning heat rose from the earth in visible waves, and somewhere ahead, past the line of oak trees that marked the edge of the home property, she could hear children. Not laughing this time, crying. She moved faster without deciding to. The tenant settlement was a cluster of perhaps 8 or 10 modest homes arranged around a common well with a kitchen garden to the south and a lean-to that served as something between a stable and a storage shed. Eleanor had been told once by her father before the wedding that Thornwood's tenant families were well kept, that Alexander Hawthorne ran a fair operation. She had accepted this the way she accepted most things in those early months on faith without investigation. What she found was a woman standing in a doorway with a child pressed against her shoulder, the child's breathing audible from 20 feet away. A wrong sound, a wet and labored sound that Eleanor recognized from her youngest brother's illness 7 years ago. The winter he had nearly died of croup. The woman looked up when Eleanor approached, and her expression shifted through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, wariness, and then a desperate reaching hope. "Ma'am," she said. Her name, Eleanor would learn, was Ruth Calloway. Her husband worked the North Tobacco Field. She had 4 children, and this one, the youngest, was 2 years old and had been sick since Sunday. "Where is Dr. Harrington?" Eleanor asked. "He ain't come yet. Supposed to be here by 9. Ruth's arms tightened around the child. "It's past 10 now." Eleanor looked at the child. His lips had a faint bluish cast at the corners that she did not like at all. "Has he eaten?" "Won't take nothing. Won't drink neither, not since yesterday evening." "Is there boiled water in the house?" Ruth blinked. Yes. I kept the fire." "Good." Eleanor stepped forward. "May I come in?" Ruth stepped aside without another word. The inside of the cottage was small and clean, in the way that things are clean when someone has worked very hard to make them so, with very little. Eleanor sat down with the child. His name was James, and he was too tired to be frightened of her, and she did the things she remembered from that winter, with her brother. Steam from the kettle held at the right distance the particular position that helped the airway open the cool cloth on the back of the neck. She did not know if she was doing it right. She did not pretend she did. She stayed anyway. Dr. Samuel Harrington arrived 40 minutes late, apologizing before he was through the door, a fence down on the Mallory property, a horse that wouldn't cooperate 3 miles of Virginia summer. He stopped when he saw Eleanor sitting on the cottage floor with a tenant woman's child against her shoulder. He was perhaps 35. Brown hair gone slightly gray at the temples. Steady hands, and the kind of eyes that looked directly at a person, without apparent effort, which Eleanor had learned to notice, because it was rarer than it should have been. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. She looked up. "You know who I am. I've seen you from a distance, at the Founders' Day gathering in April." He set his bag down and crouched to examine the child without any of the hesitation that men of his education often brought into poor people's homes. "How long has he been like this?" "Since I arrived about an hour ago. He's breathing easier than he was." Harrington glanced at her, then back at the boy. "What did you do? Steam, positioning, cool compress at the neck." She met his look evenly. "My younger brother had croup. I was 15. He was quiet for a moment, listening to the child's chest, with a practiced ear pressed gently to his back. "You may have bought him the time he needed," he said finally. "Another hour without intervention, and we'd have been in serious trouble." Ruth Calloway made a sound against her hand. Eleanor looked at James, who had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep against her shoulder, and felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like I did a thing that mattered. She could not remember the last time she had felt that. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" Harrington was looking at her with a directness that was not rude, but was entirely without the social performance that men of education usually brought to interactions with women of her class. "You didn't just stand there. You helped save this child's life." Eleanor stood carefully so as not to wake the boy and handed him back to his mother. "I did what needed doing," she said. "Most people don't." He picked up his bag. "Most people wait to be told." She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. She straightened her dress. She looked at Ruth, who was holding her son, and crying silently in the way of someone who had been holding themselves together for days and had finally been given permission to come apart. "I'll come back Thursday," Eleanor said. "If that's all right." Ruth looked at her like no one had ever asked her that before. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "That'd be yes. Thank you." Eleanor walked out into the heat. Behind her she heard Harrington's footsteps, and then his voice low and matter-of-fact. "Same direction?" he asked, nodding toward the path back to the main house. "I suppose so." They walked together in silence for a moment. The summer grass was loud with insects. The sky was enormous and white-blue and indifferent. "Do you come out to the settlement often?" he asked. "No," she said. Today was the first time. He absorbed this without comment. Then, "Why today?" Eleanor considered the question. She thought about the blue guest room and the footsteps in the corridor and her husband's voice through the wall and the seat at the far end of a very long table. She thought about Thomas's face when she'd asked if anyone had ever inquired after his welfare and the particular hollow sound of the word "no" coming back at her. "I needed to be somewhere I could do something," she said. Harrington nodded slowly, like that answer made a particular kind of sense to him. "That's a fair reason," he said. They parted at the Oak Line. He went south toward the Mallory property. She turned north back toward Thornwood Hall, back toward the long table, and the separate rooms, and the summer that was sitting on the house like a held breath. But something was different in her spine. She walked differently. Taller maybe, or maybe not taller, just more deliberate, like her feet had decided to mean something. She did not yet know what to call what had happened that morning in Ruth Calloway's cottage. She only knew that it was the first real thing she had done in 11 months. She returned to the house to find that Alexander and Margaret had come back from their ride and taken lunch without her. Mrs. Draper informed her of this in the kitchen in a tone so carefully neutral it amounted to an apology. Eleanor thanked her, took a piece of bread and some cold chicken, and ate standing at the kitchen window, which was something she had never done before in this house, and which felt unexpectedly absurdly like freedom. Through the kitchen window she could see the back garden, and in the back garden she could see two figures, Alexander, his jacket removed, sitting on the stone bench beneath the sycamore, and Margaret beside him, turned toward him with her whole body in the manner of a woman who has practiced the art of making a man feel centered. Her hand was on his arm. He was not pulling away. Eleanor ate her chicken. She turned from the window before she had finished looking. That afternoon she wrote 3 letters to her mother, to her father's old solicitor, and to the county library board, inquiring about their collection of medical texts. Her mother's letter was the longest and the most carefully worded. She did not say she was unhappy. She said she was finding ways to be useful. She said the summer at Thornwood was warm and the fields were doing well. She sealed all 3 letters and left them for the post. Then she went to the small study off the main corridor, the room that had been designated loosely as hers, which she had furnished with a writing desk and 2 chairs and a shelf of novels, and which Alexander had never once entered, and she sat down and she thought. She thought about 11 months. She thought about patience as a strategy, and whether patience, when indefinitely extended, became something else, became complicity, became erasure, became consent. She thought about Ruth Calloway crying silently in the cottage and the particular quality of a grief that has been held alone too long. She thought about what Harrington had said. Most people wait to be told. She had been waiting. She had been waiting to be told she was wanted here, waiting to be told she was seen, waiting for Alexander Hawthorne to turn from whatever ghost he was facing and find her standing there in the present tense, alive and patient and steady, and decide that she was worth the effort of being known. He had not turned, and she was beginning to suspect that waiting was not a virtue. It was just a slower way of disappearing. She picked up her pen. She did not write anything. She held it for a long time in the quiet of the small study, while the summer afternoon pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the upper corridor, a door closed. Supper that evening was worse than the night before, which she would not have thought possible. Margaret arrived at the table in pale yellow silk. She had changed again, a second outfit in 2 days, a quiet declaration of resources, and she brought with her a particular energy that Eleanor was beginning to recognize. Not malice exactly. Malice would have been cleaner. It was something more like performance. Margaret Fairfax moved through rooms the way an actress moves through a stage, aware of every angle, every eyeline, every moment in which she might be observed to best effect. And tonight, she had a story. "I must tell you both," she began as the soup was being served. "What Evelyn's grandmother said to me last Christmas. You know she keeps that portrait of Evelyn in the front parlor, the one done the summer before she got sick, and she told me, she said, Margaret, every time I look at that painting, I think how she should have been here. She should have had this life. She should have had Thornwood." Alexander's spoon stopped moving. Eleanor watched him from the far end of the table. Grandmother always did think highly of Alexander. Margaret continued with the practiced warmth of someone delivering a blow padded in silk. She said he was the only man who ever truly understood Evelyn, that they were her word fated. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Eleanor set her spoon down with a quiet click of silver on porcelain that was perhaps a fraction louder than it needed to be. Margaret looked at her. Alexander did not. "What a comfort it must be," Eleanor said, "to believe the people we've lost were claimed by fate. It makes grief feel purposeful." Margaret's smile was a masterwork of diplomacy. "I think it does, yes. Though I suppose," Eleanor continued, the same calm in her voice, the same careful enunciation, "that fate leaves very little room for the living." A silence arrived at the table that had more texture than most silences. Alexander looked up. It was the first time in 3 days, the first time perhaps in much longer than that he looked at Eleanor directly. Not past her. Not through her. At her. Like he had only just remembered she was there and was not entirely certain what to do with the discovery. Eleanor picked her spoon back up and returned to her soup. She had said what she meant to say. She did not need a response. She had not been asking a question. After supper, Margaret suggested they take the evening air on the front porch, and Alexander agreed, and Eleanor said she had correspondence to finish and retired to the small study. She sat there for an hour without doing anything. At some point, there was a knock at the study door. A short knock, slightly uncertain, not the knock of a servant. She looked up. "Come in." Alexander opened the door. He stood in the doorway and looked at her sitting at her desk with a pen she hadn't been using and a blank page she hadn't been filling, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched. "You weren't on the porch," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." He looked at the desk, at the blank page, back at her face. "What are you writing?" Nothing yet. Another pause. He had removed his jacket. He was in shirt sleeves, which she had seen perhaps 4 times in 11 months. He looked older in the lamplight than he did in the day, or perhaps just more himself, the edges less managed. "Mrs. Draper mentioned you went out to the settlement this morning," he said. Eleanor set her pen down. "I did. That's..." He seemed to be selecting words with unusual care. "That's not something you've done before." "No," she said. "It isn't." "Why today?" She looked at him. He had asked the same question Harrington had asked, and she wondered if he would recognize the answer. "I needed to be somewhere I could do something," she said. He absorbed this. She watched him try to locate a suitable response and fail, and settle instead for, "The settlement families are well cared for." "Ruth Calloway's son nearly died this morning," Eleanor said quite evenly. "He would have, I think, if I hadn't been there when I was." Alexander stared at her. He had croup, severe. Dr. Harrington was delayed. She held her husband's gaze without blinking. "I knew what to do, so I did it." Something moved across Alexander Hawthorne's face that she had no name for something that was not quite guilt and not quite admiration, and perhaps not either of those things at all, but was unmistakably something. He had not looked at her like that before. She was very sure of it. "I didn't know you had medical knowledge," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. It came out without sharpness. It was simply true, and they both knew it. And she watched the truth arrive in his face with the slow, quiet force of something that had been inevitable. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the floor briefly, and then back at her. "Eleanor." "It's late," she said. She stood gathering her papers in a single smooth motion. "I think I'll go up." She moved past him toward the door, and he didn't stop her, and she didn't expect him to. But at the threshold, she paused, not turning fully just enough, and said without inflection, "Good night, Alexander." A beat. "Good night," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something careful and unsteady, like a man finding his footing on ground he had been certain was solid. She climbed the stairs alone. The next 4 days settled into a pattern that Eleanor had not designed, but recognized a kind of testing maybe, or a renegotiation so subtle it almost wasn't one. She went to the settlement every Thursday morning, and then began going Tuesdays as well, because Ruth's boy was improving, but slowly, and because there were 3 other families with needs, she was only now beginning to see clearly. She brought preserves one morning, and a book of children's Bible stories another, and asked Mrs. Draper to teach her what remedies the kitchen kept on hand. Mrs. Draper, who had been at Thornwood for 20 years, and had never been asked her opinion on anything by the mistress of the house, looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and then said quietly, "Yes, ma'am," and taught her everything. Harrington continued to appear on Thursdays. Their exchanges were brief, professional, and entirely respectful, 2 people focused on the same task, which Eleanor found she preferred enormously to the alternative of being talked at, or around, or through. He told her one morning while they were both occupied with a difficult birth in the Miller cottage, the wife had been laboring since midnight. Harrington sweating through his shirt. Eleanor doing exactly what he told her to do, without flinching. "You have a steady hand, Mrs. Hawthorne." "Thank you," she said. "I mean it as an observation, not a compliment. Some people freeze when it matters. You don't." He glanced at her over the top of the woman's head. "That's useful." "Then I'm glad to be useful," she said. The baby arrived at 7:30 in the morning, red-faced and furious, and entirely healthy. Eleanor held it for approximately 45 seconds, while Harrington tended to the mother. And in those 45 seconds, she felt something so uncomplicated and warm that she had to look away from the child's face before she did something embarrassing. She handed the baby to its mother. She walked outside. She stood in the summer morning and breathed in the heavy Virginia air and tried to remember the last time she had felt this entirely certain that she was exactly where she needed to be. She could not remember. That frightened her and steadied her both at once. At Thornwood, Margaret Fairfax was conducting a campaign that Eleanor understood with increasing clarity, even as she chose deliberately, strategically, not to engage it directly. Margaret was reclaiming territory that had never technically been hers. She rearranged the flowers in the front parlor, the way she mentioned casually Evelyn had always preferred. She suggested at dinner that the dining room might benefit from blue drapery, Evelyn's favorite color. She told Alexander stories about his first courtship with a detail and intimacy that required Eleanor to sit very still in her chair and remind herself that she had made a decision back in that study with the blank page, and she was going to keep it. She would not compete. Not because she couldn't. She was beginning to understand that she was in certain ways more capable than she had been taught to believe. She would not compete because she had decided quietly, certainly with the same composure she had used to pour wine across the table from her husband's grief, that if Alexander Hawthorne chose a dead woman over a living one, then that was a truth she needed to know. And she would rather know it clearly than win it dishonestly. What she had not expected was Alexander. He began appearing, not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves. He simply began being in the same rooms as Eleanor, at times he had not been before. He was in the front hall when she returned from the settlement on Tuesday morning, under the pretext of something with the postal delivery. He came to the dining room for breakfast twice in 1 week, something that had not happened since March. He asked one evening if he might sit in on her lesson with Mrs. Draper about the medicinal herbs. A request so unexpected that Mrs. Draper actually blinked twice before recovering. And he sat in the kitchen corner with his long legs folded awkwardly on a stool and said almost nothing. Just watched Eleanor work through the identification of yarrow and comfrey and chamomile, with the focused attention of a man who had forgotten something and was trying to remember what it was. She did not make it easy for him. She was not cold. She was not punishing. She simply did not perform for him anymore. She did not arrange herself, did not soften her edges, did not modulate her intelligence to something more comfortable. She was simply Eleanor Fully, the version that had been sitting in the small study and the tenant cottages and the kitchen this whole time, the one that had been waiting for someone to look. He was looking. She was no longer sure what to do with that. She was no longer sure it was enough. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a day she had planned for anything. She was coming down the main staircase at mid-morning, a stack of books under one arm. Medical texts she had finally received from the county library, which had yielded to her written request, with what she suspected was no small degree of surprise when she heard Margaret's voice from the front parlor, the door ajar, the tone intimate and carrying. "She's not suited to you, Alexander. Anyone with eyes can see it. She's pleasant enough, I suppose, but she doesn't understand you. Not the way Evelyn did." Eleanor stopped on the fourth stair from the bottom. "Margaret." Alexander's voice was low. "I'm not trying to be unkind," Margaret continued. "I'm trying to say I see how you look when you're with her. I see how you look when you're alone. You're a man who needs something that she simply doesn't." I said enough. His voice had sharpened. A pause. "Alexander." "I said enough, Margaret." Something had changed in his voice, something Eleanor had not heard there before. "Don't speak about my wife that way." Silence. Eleanor stood on the fourth stair from the bottom with her stack of medical books pressed against her ribs and her heart doing something loud and unsteady. She waited. She counted 4 of her own breaths. Then she continued down the stairs. She crossed the entry hall. She pushed open the front door. She walked out into the summer morning without her hat, which she had forgotten, and went down the porch steps and across the yard and out through the gate toward the settlement path. Because she needed to walk, and she needed the earth under her feet, and she needed very badly, in a way she had not needed anything in a long time, to be somewhere the air was honest. "Don't speak about my wife that way." She did not know what it meant. She did not know if it meant what she wanted it to mean, or something smaller, a matter of pride, a man defending his household against a houseguest's overreach. She did not know if Alexander Hawthorne had spoken those words out of feeling, or out of principle, or out of some combination of the two that would resolve into nothing she could hold. But she had heard them. She had heard them, and they were in her now, taking up space. She wasn't sure she wanted them to take up complicating something she had been in the process of making simple. She had been in the process of leaving not Thornwood, not physically, but something. She had been leaving the version of herself that waited and hoped and arranged herself to be seen. She had been becoming something new, something that did not require his recognition to know its own worth. And then he had to go and say that. She walked faster. Ahead of her, the oak trees threw their shade across the path and the summer pressed down from above. And somewhere in the settlement, a dog was barking at something, and Eleanor Hawthorne walked into the ordinary world and tried to decide what she was going to do with a husband who had finally, 11 months too late, remembered she existed. She walked until the anger settled into something she could carry. That was the only way she knew how to handle the feelings that had no clean name. Walk them until they changed shape, until they became something manageable. Something she could set down in a corner of herself and leave there while she got on with the business of being present. By the time she reached the settlement, she had done that much. She had put, "Don't speak about my wife that way," into a small locked room in the back of her chest, and she had turned away from the door, and she had kept walking. Ruth Calloway met her at the gate with James on her hip. The boy pink-cheeked and bright-eyed in a way that stopped Eleanor's breath slightly every time she saw it. This child, who had been blue-lipped and laboring a week ago, now pulling at his mother's braid with the cheerful tyranny of a 2-year-old who had no idea how close the world had come to losing him. "He ate this morning," Ruth said immediately by way of greeting. "All of it. Porridge and everything." "Good," Eleanor said, and meant it from a place that had nothing to do with the house she had just left. "That's very good, Ruth." She stayed 2 hours. She helped Mrs. Garner, the elderly widow at the far end of the settlement, hang her washing. The woman's hands had developed a shake that made the work slow and frustrating, and she accepted Eleanor's help with a dignity that asked for nothing, but was grateful for everything. She sat with the Hendersons' eldest daughter, 14 years old and dangerously feverish, and held the girl's wrist, and counted her pulse the way Harrington had shown her, and determined it was fast, but not alarmingly so, and left instructions for cold compresses and willow bark tea brewed weak. She was competent here in a way that she was not competent at Thornwood. At Thornwood she was decorative peripheral, a name on a household ledger. Here she was needed specifically in ways that had to do with her actual hands and her actual knowledge and her actual presence in a room. The distinction had begun to mean everything to her. She was wringing out a cloth for the Henderson girl when she heard boots on the threshold and looked up to find Harrington ducking through the low doorway, his bag over one shoulder, and his expression doing that thing it did when he was calculating several things at once and trying not to show it. He looked at the girl. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the compress and the cup of willow bark tea on the table. "Pulse," he said. 90, maybe 95, down from what her mother described this morning. He nodded, set his bag down, and took over with the smooth efficiency of a man who trusted the information he'd been given. Eleanor moved aside without being asked. They worked alongside each other for 20 minutes, and at the end of it, the girl was resting easier, and Harrington was washing his hands at the basin, and Eleanor was standing near the window, not quite ready to leave yet. "You're getting faster," he said without looking up from the basin. "I'm learning," she said. "There's a difference. Most people learn slowly because they're afraid of being wrong. You learn fast because you're more afraid of doing nothing." He dried his hands on the cloth by the basin and finally turned to look at her. "Something happened this morning?" It was not a question. Eleanor considered denying it. She was practiced at that, at presenting the composed surface and keeping the weather underneath to herself. But she was tired suddenly of that particular skill. It had kept her very private and very alone for 11 months, and she was not sure it was serving her anymore. "My husband defended me," she said. "To his dead wife's sister. I overheard it." Harrington was quiet for a moment. "And that upset you?" "It confused me." She looked at the sleeping girl. "I had made a decision. I had decided I was finished waiting for him to see me. I had decided I was going to build something here, something real, something mine, and it was going to be enough. And then he said those words, and now I can't—" She stopped. "I can't locate the decision anymore." Harrington leaned against the wall and folded his arms, not in a closed way, but in the way of a man settling in to think alongside someone. What was the decision exactly? To stop needing him to recognize me. "And you think one sentence undoes that?" "I think," she said carefully, "that hope is a very difficult thing to bury, especially when it keeps coming back breathing." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unperformed attention she had come to expect from him and still hadn't gotten used to. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "what do you actually want? Not what you've decided, not what you've made peace with. What do you want?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was so much more dangerous than the composed one. "I want to matter to him," she said finally quietly. "I want to be in a marriage that has both people in it. I want—" She stopped again. "I want the thing I thought I was getting when I said yes, and I'm very tired of wanting something that may not exist." Harrington nodded slowly. "Then the question," he said, "isn't whether he's capable of giving it. The question is whether you're willing to find out, and how much more time you're prepared to spend discovering the answer." She looked at him. He wasn't telling her what to do. He wasn't offering comfort or a solution. He was simply handing her the thing she had already known and asking her to hold it. She appreciated that more than she could say. "Thank you," she said. "I haven't done anything." "You've done more than you know," she said. "Most people talk at me. You talk with me. There's a difference." He smiled, a brief, genuine thing that changed his face into something younger. "Go home, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Whatever you're going to decide, you can't decide it in the Henderson cottage." She laughed, a small, surprised sound that she had not planned. It had been a very long time since she had laughed without planning it. She went home. Margaret Fairfax came to Eleanor's study that evening. She did not knock. She opened the door with the certainty of a woman who had decided that preliminary courtesies were no longer required between them, and she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her, and she looked at Eleanor sitting at her desk with the medical texts open, and said very pleasantly, "We should speak frankly, I think." Eleanor set her pen down. "All right." Margaret sat in the chair across from the desk. Eleanor's chair, the one she had placed there for her own reading without being invited. She arranged her skirts. She folded her hands. She looked at Eleanor the way she had that first afternoon, in the manner of someone cataloging the furniture, except now Eleanor recognized it for what it was, a woman taking stock of a threat she had underestimated. "You overheard Alexander this morning," Margaret said. "I was on the stairs," Eleanor said. "Yes." "Then you know he was simply being dutiful. It's his nature. He would defend any woman in his household from discourtesy. He's a gentleman." She said it gently, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone simple. "It didn't mean what you may have wanted it to mean." Eleanor looked at her. She took her time with it. "Miss Fairfax," she said, "what is it you're actually trying to accomplish here?" The pleasantness on Margaret's face shifted a fractional recalibration, like a performer adjusting for an unexpected audience. "I'm being honest with you, woman to woman. I think you deserve." "What I deserve," Eleanor said quietly and without heat, "is not something you're in a position to determine." She closed the medical text. "You came here with a purpose. I've watched you for 3 weeks. I know what it is. And I'm telling you plainly that I am not afraid of you. I'm not going to fight you for my husband's attention, because I don't conduct myself that way. But I am also not going to pretend that I don't know what you're doing." Margaret's composure held. It was very good, her composure. Eleanor gave her that. "You don't know what I'm doing," Margaret said. "You're keeping Evelyn alive in this house," Eleanor said. "Because as long as Evelyn is alive in this house, you have a role. You're the guardian of his grief. You're necessary. Without the grief, you're just a woman who needs somewhere to stay in August." She paused. "I'm sorry for your loss. Truly. She was your sister. That is a real thing, and I don't minimize it. But you are using it, and I think you know you are." Silence. For the first time since she had arrived at Thornwood, Margaret Fairfax said nothing. She stood. She smoothed her skirts with one slow, precise gesture. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that had finally dropped all its preparation and was just a face. A tired face. A face that had been performing something for a long time, and was very briefly, involuntarily not. "He loved her very much," she said, and the voice was different. Quieter, rougher, and far more real than anything she had said in 3 weeks. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's not the problem." Margaret left without answering. Eleanor sat in the study for a long time after the door closed. She stared at the cover of the medical text. She breathed. She thought about what she had just done. The particular courage it had taken, not the dramatic courage of confrontation, but the quieter, harder kind, the courage of saying the true thing in the true words without raising her voice. She had not known, until just now, that she had it. Alexander came to her study again that night. This time he knocked. "Come in," she said. He was different tonight. She noticed it the moment he entered, something in the quality of how he moved, something less armored, less managed. He looked like a man who had been having a long argument with himself all day and had arrived at an uneasy truce. He did not take the chair Margaret had sat in. He stood near the bookshelf and looked at the spines of the medical texts she'd received from the library, 3 of them stacked beside the novels they'd replaced. "These are new," he said. "From the county library. I wrote to them several weeks ago." He touched the spine of one. "Harrington's influence. My own curiosity," she said. "Dr. Harrington has been generous with his knowledge, but the interest was already there. I simply hadn't been pointed in a useful direction." Alexander turned from the bookshelf. He looked at her in that new way, the way he'd started looking at her since the night she'd told him what she'd done for Ruth's boy. Like he was reading something he hadn't known was written there. "Margaret is leaving Friday," he said. Eleanor kept her expression even. "I see. I asked her to." He held her gaze. "I should have done it sooner." She said nothing. She waited because she had learned in the last several weeks that waiting was not always defeat. Sometimes it was simply giving a thing the space to arrive at its own pace. "Eleanor." He said her name differently than he had in the study 2 weeks ago. It had weight in it now. Intention. "I owe you." He stopped, pressed his jaw, started again. "I have not been what I should have been this past year." "No," she agreed. "You haven't." He blinked slightly like he had expected something softer. But she was done with soft where softness wasn't true. "I was—" He moved to the window, turned back. "When Evelyn died, I thought I understood what I was capable of. I thought a man who has loved once and lost it, that's what he is. That's the full length of him." He looked at the floor briefly. "I convinced myself that what I was offering you was enough. A name, a home, a comfortable life. That the other thing, she repeated, the feeling of it." His voice dropped. "I told myself it wasn't something I had left to give, that it would be dishonest to try, that you were better served by stability than by a man pretending at something he couldn't." "Alexander." She stood up. He stopped talking immediately. She came around the desk and stood in front of him close enough that there was no more managing the distance between them, no more table 12 feet long. "You didn't ask me," she said. "That is the thing. You decided for yourself what I needed and what I deserved and what this marriage would be, and you did not ask me. I was 20 years old, and I came here, and I tried." Her voice held. She was proud of that. "I tried very hard to be what you needed, and I could not see you past the door you had closed. And I waited, and I waited, and I—" She stopped. She pressed her fingers against her sternum briefly just once, like setting something back in place. "I stopped waiting," she said. "Recently. I stopped waiting, and I started building something else. And I need you to know that what I've built, what I'm building, is mine. I am not going to dismantle it because you have decided 11 months on to open the door." He was looking at her like she was the most unexpected landscape he had ever stood inside. "I'm not asking you to dismantle anything," he said. His voice was very low. "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the summer night pressed against the windows, loud and dark and alive. "I don't know yet," he said. And for the first time, she heard in him something she recognized, the particular honesty of a person who has run out of performance and is speaking from whatever is actually there. "I don't know. But I want to ask the right things. I want to do it properly this time." He met her eyes. "I know I don't have the right to ask for patience again. I know I've spent all the credit I had for that." "Yes," she said. "You have. Then I'm not asking for patience." He took one step toward her, one deliberate, plainly visible. "I'm asking for the chance to show you that I understand what I lost, and what I still have if you're willing to let me see." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at Ruth Calloway's son that first morning, with the particular attention of someone taking inventory, assessing what was real and what needed watching. What she saw was a man who was afraid. Not of her, not exactly. Afraid of himself. Afraid of the size of what he had done wrong and the smallness of what he was offering in response. afraid that he had spent 11 months making himself into a man that a woman like her would not want. She thought he was probably right to be afraid. She also thought, and this was the part she had not planned on, the part that had been living in the locked room with, "Don't speak about my wife that way." She thought that afraid was different from wrong. That a man who knew he had failed, who could sit with that knowledge without flinching from it, was a different creature from a man who had failed and rationalized it. She did not reach for him. She was not ready for that. She was not sure she would be ready soon. But she said, "Then show me." 2 words. Quiet and direct, and carrying the full weight of everything she was and was not willing to give. He exhaled a long, slow breath like something being set down after a very long carry. "All right," he said. Margaret Fairfax left on Friday morning as promised. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the carriage go. Margaret did not look back. Eleanor had not expected her to, and did not wish she had. What she had not expected was what happened after the carriage turned the bend in the road and disappeared behind the tree line. Alexander came to stand beside her on the porch, not close. A respectful distance, the distance of someone who understood exactly how much ground he had to recover. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the road where the carriage had been. "She'll go to her cousin in Richmond," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. Another silence, comfortable almost in its shared orientation toward the same empty space. "I'd like to ride out to the settlement with you," he said. "Next Thursday, if that would be acceptable." Eleanor looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the road. His jaw was set in that way it had when he was bracing for something. "You'd be in the way," she said. He turned to look at her, and something, the absolute seriousness of her face, the way she said it so plainly, cracked through him, and he did something she had never once seen Alexander Hawthorne do. He laughed. A real laugh. Short, surprised, helpless. It changed his whole face. Eleanor felt something warm move through her chest, like the first hour of sun after a very long winter. She did not let it reach her face. She was not ready to let it reach her face. But she held it there in the locked room beside the other things she was not ready for yet. "I could be useful," he said when he had recovered himself. "We'll see," she said. She walked back into the house. He stayed on the porch a moment longer. She could feel him standing there behind her, not following, not yet just standing in the space she had moved through. That was something she thought. That a man like Alexander Hawthorne was standing still in a space she had left rather than moving on ahead of her as though she hadn't passed. It was not everything. It was not even close to everything. But it was the first time in 11 months that something in this house had moved in her direction. She was paying attention. He came to the settlement on Thursday. Eleanor had half expected him to forget, or to find a reason: the East Field, the tobacco audit, the 100 legitimate demands of a man who ran 2,000 acres, to quietly withdraw the offer. She had prepared herself for that. She had told herself it would be fine, that it would simply be data, one more piece of information about who Alexander Hawthorne actually was, beneath the version of himself he was currently attempting. He was waiting on the porch when she came downstairs at 7:30. He had dressed plainly work clothes, the kind he wore to the fields, not the formal coat he put on for county business. He had his hat in his hand, and he looked standing there in the morning light, slightly uncertain in a way she had not seen on him before. Like a man who has arrived somewhere and is not entirely sure of the protocol. "You're early," she said. "I didn't want to be late," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked past him down the porch steps and onto the path, and after a brief pause, she heard him fall into step behind her. They walked in silence through the summer morning. The fields were already loud with the sounds of early labor, the distant calls of workers, the rhythmic thud of someone splitting wood far to the north. Eleanor moved at her usual pace, which was faster than most people expected from a woman in skirts, and Alexander matched it without comment. It was Ruth Calloway who greeted them at the settlement gate, James balanced on her hip as always, and whose face went through a remarkable sequence of expressions when she saw who was walking beside Eleanor. Surprise. Wariness. A careful, composed blankness that Eleanor recognized as the particular expression of a tenant who has learned not to show too much in front of a landowner. "Mr. Hawthorne," Ruth said. "Mrs. Calloway?" Alexander nodded. He looked at the boy on her hip. "This is the child Mrs. Hawthorne told me about." "James?" Ruth's eyes flicked to Eleanor, a quick questioning look. Eleanor gave her the smallest nod. "Yes, sir," Ruth said. "He's doing well now. Real well." Alexander looked at the boy for a moment. James, with the complete indifference of a 2-year-old toward the social hierarchies of adults, reached out one small hand and grabbed the brim of the hat Alexander was holding. Alexander went very still. Then slowly, he let the boy have it. James immediately put it on his head. It dropped over his eyes entirely. He made a sound of supreme satisfaction. Ruth laughed, a real laugh startled out of her before she could manage it, and Alexander smiled, and it was the same smile Eleanor had seen on the porch when she'd told him he'd be in the way, unplanned, genuine arriving on his face, like something he'd forgotten he was capable of. Eleanor watched all of this and said nothing, and filed it away in the part of herself that was still taking inventory. They worked through the morning. Eleanor went about her usual rounds, the Henderson girl who was recovered and embarrassed to have been sick. Old Mrs. Garner, who was delighted by the unexpected visit from the estate owner, and pressed both of them to take tea, which they did seated on either side of her small table, while she talked at length about the summer of 1798, and a goat she had once owned, named Perseverance. Alexander listened to every word with what appeared to be genuine attention. He asked 2 questions about the goat. Eleanor, watching him over the rim of her teacup, felt something she did not want to feel yet. Something that was going to complicate everything if she let it. She drank her tea. When Harrington arrived at 9:30, he stopped at the sight of Alexander with the same calibrated composure Eleanor had come to expect from him, a man who encountered surprises and processed them internally before allowing anything to reach his face. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, extending his hand. "Dr. Harrington?" Alexander took it. "My wife speaks well of your work here." Something passed briefly across Harrington's face, not quite amusement, not quite assessment. He glanced at Eleanor. "She's been invaluable herself," he said. "I hope you're planning to send her back next week." "That's entirely her decision," Alexander said. Harrington looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once and went to see to his patients. On the walk back to Thornwood, Alexander was quiet for longer than usual. Eleanor let him be. She had learned the texture of his silences. There was the closed silence, the one he used to keep people out. And there was this one which was the silence of a man actually thinking, actually arriving somewhere he hadn't started the morning. "I didn't know," he said finally. "What didn't you know? How much was needed? Out here?" He was looking at the path ahead. "I've managed this estate for 8 years. I know every acre, every yield, every lease agreement. I review the accounts monthly. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought management was the same as care." Eleanor walked beside him and did not fill the silence he left. "It isn't, is it?" he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." He absorbed this with the expression of a man being handed a truth he has earned. "The Calloway boy. Ruth told me after you went to see Mrs. Garner, she told me what you did that first morning, what he looked like when you arrived, what you did." He glanced at her. "She said she'd prayed for something to come down that path, and you're what came." Eleanor kept walking. Her throat had tightened slightly, and she had no intention of letting it show. "I was just walking," she said. "You weren't," he said quietly. "You were deciding something. She told me that too. She said you walked in like a woman who'd made her mind up about something, and she didn't know what, but it felt like the first honest thing she'd seen come out of the main house in years." Eleanor stopped walking. Alexander stopped a half step later and turned to look at her. She was looking at him with an expression she couldn't entirely control. Not hurt, but something close to it. The thing hurt becomes when it's been sitting in a person long enough to turn into a kind of sorrow. "The first honest thing," she said. He held her gaze. Yes. That's a damning thing for the mistress of the house to hear about her own home. I know, he said. I know it is. She started walking it again. He fell back into step beside her. They covered 50 yards in silence before she said anything. Do you know what I was deciding that morning? She asked. Tell me. I was deciding whether to stop, she said. Trying, waiting, being the person in this marriage who wanted it. She kept her voice even. It cost her something to do that. I had been in your house for 11 months, and I had never once been asked a single question about who I was, what I cared about, what I was capable of. I was a convenience and a household function, and I had finally that morning, after hearing you in the corridor the night before. She paused. I had finally decided that I would stop auditioning for a part that was never going to be cast. Alexander said nothing. She could feel him beside her, very still receiving it. And then, she said, and her voice did something she hadn't planned, a slight fracture that she sealed immediately. You went and said those words to Margaret. Don't speak about my wife that way, he said quietly, repeating his own words back to her. Yes. Eleanor, I know what it might have meant, she said quickly before he could offer her something she wasn't ready to accept. I know it might have been principle, a gentleman's reflex. I'm not... She stopped herself. Started again. I'm not holding you to those words. I'm not building something on 6 seconds of overheard conversation. I learned this past year not to build on things that haven't been offered to me directly. He caught her arm. Not roughly, just a hand on her arm, his grip careful and deliberate, stopping her. She stopped. She turned to look at him. They were standing in the oak shade, the heat of the summer pressing around them, birdsong and field noise from all directions, and Alexander Hawthorne was looking at her with an expression she had not seen in 11 months of marriage and had stopped believing she would see. I am offering it to you directly, he said. Right now. Those words, they were not reflex. They were not principle. They were... He stopped. His jaw worked. When she said you weren't suited to me, that you didn't understand me. His voice dropped further. I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, and it was not indignation on behalf of a household member. It was... He looked at her like a man trying to say something true that he has no practice saying. It was fury, because she was wrong, because I have spent 12 months not seeing you, and in the last 3 weeks I've watched you hold a sick child and face down a woman twice as practiced as either of us, and sit in a tenant widow's kitchen and laugh when you thought no one could hear you and Eleanor. His hand tightened slightly on her arm. You understand me better than anyone who has ever stood in that house, including her, including me. The summer was very loud around them. Eleanor stood in it and breathed and looked at Alexander Hawthorne's face and tried to determine the difference between what she wanted to hear and what was actually being said. She had gotten good at that distinction. It had taken 11 months of practice. That is a great deal, she said carefully, to say on a Thursday morning on a footpath. I know. And I don't. She stepped back gently, removing her arm from his hold. Not a rejection. A request for space, which he respected immediately, which told her something. I don't know how to receive it yet. I need you to understand that. I have been very carefully putting myself back together this past month, and I am not ready to... She searched for the right word. To rearrange everything, just because you've arrived. I'm not asking you to rearrange anything, he said. Then what are you asking? To be let in? He said. Simply, without artifice. That's all. Just let me in to wherever you've been going, the things you're building. I don't want to take them from you. I want to... He exhaled. I want to see them. She looked at him for a long moment. You'll have to earn it, she said. I know. I'm not saying it to punish you. I know that too. She turned and began walking again. After a moment, he joined her, and they walked the rest of the way to Thornwood in a silence that was different from every silence they had shared before. Not closed, not managed, not the careful mutual avoidance of two people sharing space without sharing anything. It was the silence of two people who had just said true things and were living in the aftermath of them. When they reached the porch, she stopped with her hand on the door. "Next Thursday," she said without turning around. "You can come again." She heard his exhale. "Thank you," he said. She went inside. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's life, stranger even than the 11 months before, because she had understood those months. She had understood loneliness. She had understood the particular discipline of keeping herself intact in a house that did not see her. What she did not entirely know how to navigate was this Alexander Hawthorne trying. He was not graceful at it. She had not expected grace. He was a man who had spent years inside his own walls, and he did not dismantle them quickly or smoothly. He moved toward her in fits and starts with occasional retreats that were not cold exactly, but were clearly the reflex of a man relearning how to be present. He came to the settlement on Thursdays. He was in the way at first, exactly as she'd predicted he was accustomed to directing, and the settlement required a different posture, the posture of someone who listens first and acts second. She watched him figure this out in real time, watched him catch himself mid-sentence and pull back and let Ruth Calloway finish what she was saying, and she was not generous about it, but she was fair. She saw it. She counted it. He began leaving books in the study. Not dramatically, not with a note or a presentation. He would simply appear the next morning with a volume set on the corner of her desk, a treatise on herbal medicine from his own library, a history of Virginia's tenant farming laws, a novel she had mentioned once in passing in the first week of their marriage and had not expected him to remember. She read them all. She did not thank him directly. She mentioned things from them in conversation at dinner which had shifted quietly without announcement from an ordeal of silence and performance to something that occasionally resembled an actual exchange between two actual people. One evening, she looked up from her dinner and found Alexander watching her with an expression she had come to recognize, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd been holding. "What is it?" she said. He set his fork down. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if you think the answer will hurt me." She set her own fork down. "All right. Are you happier?" He held her gaze. "Than you were before? Before the settlement, before—" He gestured a brief motion that encompassed the last 6 weeks without naming them. "Are you happier now than you were when Margaret was here?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Because of the settlement. Or because of both," she said. "The settlement gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost. And you," she held his gaze, "you have made me less lonely in this house. I'm telling you that because it's true, not because you've earned the full of it yet." He nodded. "That's fair." "I know," she said, and picked up her fork, and they finished dinner. The twist arrived on a Sunday in the form of a letter. Eleanor found it on the hall table, addressed to Alexander, already opened. He had been at breakfast when the post came, and she had heard him read it and say nothing and excuse himself from the table. And by the time she came downstairs, the dining room was empty, and the letter was on the hall table where he had set it down, and she could see even from 3 feet away the name on the letterhead. Fairfax. Not Margaret. The family solicitor. A man named Aldgate out of Baltimore. She did not read it. That was a line she would not cross. But she found Alexander in the East Study, not the main library, but the smaller room where he kept the estate accounts, and she knocked and went in and set the letter on the desk in front of him. "You left this in the hall," she said. He looked at it, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on either side of the letter. Then, "Evelyn's father is contesting a portion of the estate agreement. From before, from when Evelyn and I were before she died." He stopped. "We had an understanding. Not a legal document, but an understanding between her father and mine. That if she and I married, a parcel of the eastern land 40 acres along the creek would be transferred to the Fairfax family as part of the arrangement." Eleanor waited. "We didn't marry," he said. "She died. The arrangement died with her. I thought we all understood that it died with her." His jaw tightened. "Apparently Mr. Fairfax has decided this summer with Margaret's encouragement." He stopped. His voice had gone very controlled, the kind of controlled that cost something. "That the understanding still holds. That I owe the Fairfax family 40 acres of Thornwood land as the price of a marriage that never happened." Eleanor stared at him. "And Margaret's visit," she said slowly, "was almost certainly reconnaissance." His eyes met hers. "She came to assess whether there was anyone here who would fight it, whether I was still too deep in grief to think clearly." Something moved through his expression that was not quite anger and not quite shame. I believe I may have given her reason to think the answer was yes. The room was very quiet. Eleanor thought about 3 weeks of yellow silk and Evelyn's favorite color drapery, and a hand resting on Alexander's wrist at the dinner table. She thought about a woman cataloging furniture and taking inventory of weakness. "What does the solicitor want?" she asked. "A meeting, in Richmond. He wants to present the claim formally." Alexander looked at the letter. "Aldgate is good. The Fairfax family has resources, and they have a story that will read sympathetically. Bereaved father, dead daughter, grieving man, who made promises he now won't keep." He looked up. "In a county courthouse in front of a sympathetic judge, that story has legs. But the promise was informal, no document. No document, but witnesses. Her father, 2 cousins, and—" He paused. "My own father, who is in Philadelphia, and who I have reason to believe may remember the conversation differently than I do, depending on who asks him first." Eleanor absorbed this. She looked at the letter, the desk, the man sitting behind it, who was watching her with the expression of someone who has just shown another person a wound he'd been keeping covered. "Then we need to get to your father before Aldgate does," she said. Alexander blinked. You have an attorney." "In Richmond, yes. A man named Carver. He's handled the estate for—" "Write to Carver today," she said. "Tell him to find out who Aldgate has spoken to already, and write to your father tonight before he hears from anyone in the Fairfax camp." She leaned forward slightly. "What exactly do you remember about the conversation between your father and Evelyn's?" He stared at her. "Alexander." She held his eyes. "What do you remember?" He told her. It took 20 minutes, and she listened to all of it, the timing, the language, the exact words as best he could recall them, the people in the room, the season, the year. She asked 3 questions. She remembered everything he said. When he finished, she stood up. "Write those letters," she said. "I'll help you draft them if you need, but do it today, Eleanor." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. "Why are you—" He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "You didn't have to sit down." She looked at him across the study, this man she had married a year ago, and was only now beginning to actually know. "This is my home," she said. "Thornwood is my home. Those 40 acres along the creek are where Ruth Calloway's boy learned to walk." She held his gaze without flinching. "So yes, I sat down." Something crossed Alexander Hawthorne's face, that she had no word for something that was gratitude and surprise, and something older and deeper than either. She went to find writing paper. The letters went out that same day. By Wednesday, a reply had come from Carver in Richmond, brief, urgent, and confirming what Alexander had feared. Aldgate had already made contact with 2 of the cousin witnesses and had written to the senior Hawthorne in Philadelphia. The story was being built. The Fairfax claim was real, and it was moving. Alexander told Eleanor over dinner, handing her the letter across the table. She read it. She handed it back. "Your father," she said. "What is he like?" A pause. "Principled, stubborn, not easily swayed once he's formed an opinion." "And what opinion has he formed of me?" He looked at her. "I don't know. I haven't—" He stopped. "I haven't written to him much this year. He doesn't know you, Eleanor. I haven't given him the opportunity." She received this without expression. Then I would like to write to him, she said. To my father. Yes. About this matter. About all of it, she said. About who I am. About what this year has been. About what I know of his son, which is more than I did 6 months ago. She looked at him steadily. Wives have written to fathers-in-law before. It is not an unusual thing. But I want to do it honestly. Not a performance. An actual letter. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, I'll write mine tonight. You write yours whenever you're ready. Tonight, she said. They wrote their letters at opposite ends of the same table, the long dining table, the one she had eaten at alone for 11 months. The candles burned down between them. The summer night pressed at the windows. Eleanor wrote 4 pages to a man she had never met, and she wrote them plainly, without flattery, without strategy, with only the truth as she understood it. She sealed the letter herself. She handed it to Thomas with Alexander's. Both go out tomorrow morning, she said. Yes, ma'am, Thomas said. He hesitated. Then very quietly, It's good to see you sitting at that table, Mrs. Hawthorne. The middle of it, I mean. Eleanor looked at him. He flushed to his ears and disappeared. She stood alone in the dining room for a moment. She looked at the table, at the 2 chairs, pushed back the 2 sets of candles, the 2 places where 2 people had sat and written letters side by side. The middle of it. She was not yet at the middle. She was perhaps a third of the way down from the far end, which was not the head, and not the foot, and not the place she had been. But it was not where she had started. She blew out the candles. She went upstairs. She was still not ready to ask for everything. But she was no longer willing to accept nothing. And somewhere between those 2 positions, in the honest, contested, unfinished space between them, something was being built. She could feel it under her feet, the way you feel new ground before you fully trust it. She was paying attention. She was not looking away. The reply from Philadelphia arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the letters went out. Eleanor was in the settlement when it came. She did not know it had arrived until she returned to Thornwood at midday and found Alexander waiting in the front hall with an expression she could not immediately read. Not the closed expression, not the managed one, but something more exposed than either of those. Something that had been turned over by whatever was written on the pages he was holding. He held the letter out to her without speaking. She took it. His father's handwriting was small and precise, the hand of a man who measured his words on the page, the way he measured them in conversation, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. She read it standing in the hall, Alexander watching her, neither of them moving. The senior Hawthorne had written 6 pages. The first 2 addressed the Fairfax claim directly, and with a legal clarity that told Eleanor the man had already contacted his own attorney before finishing the letter. He remembered the conversation with Evelyn's father. He remembered it, he wrote, as an expression of hope, rather than a binding arrangement. The optimistic talk of 2 fathers who wanted a thing to happen, not the formal language of men who intended to be held to terms. He would testify to that effect. He would come to Richmond if necessary. The Fairfax claim, in his assessment, had the smell of grief converted into opportunism, and he did not intend to allow it. The 3rd page was about Eleanor. She slowed when she reached it. She felt Alexander watching her slow. His father had written, I received your letter. Eleanor, I hope you will forgive the familiarity, but a woman who writes 4 pages of plain truth to a stranger she has every reason to be cautious with has earned the right to be addressed plainly in return. I want you to know that I read every word. I want you to know that I am ashamed it has taken me this long to write to you myself. I want you to know that my son has in his grief been a lesser version of himself, and that what you have described, the work you are doing, the home you are building, the patience you have offered, and the point at which you rightly stopped offering it, tells me you are exactly what Thornwood has needed, and what Alexander has needed, and what I should have been paying closer attention to this past year. She stopped reading. She read that paragraph again. Then she folded the letter carefully, the way she handled things she intended to keep, and she held it against her ribs for a moment. Eleanor? Alexander's voice was low. She looked up. Her eyes were dry. She had decided they would be, and they were. "Your father," she said, "is a good man." "He is," Alexander said. "Better than I've been. He's coming to Richmond. He arrives Thursday. He wants to meet you." He paused. "He wants to meet you before we go to Carver's office. He was in his letter to me, he said." He stopped and looked at the floor briefly in the way he had when something was costing him to say. "He said that if I had written to him about you 6 months ago the way I should have, he would have come then. He said he didn't know you existed as a person, only as a name on a household record, because I had not—" His jaw worked. "Because I had failed to introduce you to my own father as a real woman deserving his attention." The hall was very quiet. Eleanor thought about a name on a household record. She thought about 11 months of breakfast alone and a seat at the far end of a very long table. She thought about Ruth Calloway, saying it felt like the first honest thing she'd seen come out of the main house in years. "Alexander," she said. "Yes." "I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He straightened. "I'm listening." She looked at him square direct, with all of herself behind it. "I am not angry anymore," she said. "I want you to understand that. I was for a long time, and I am not anymore, and that is a real thing that has actually changed. But I need you to understand what that year cost me, not so you can feel worse than you already do. So that we don't, so that we never—" She pressed her hand to her sternum briefly, that gesture she made when she was sealing something back into place. "I built an entire life this summer because I had to, because there was nothing left to wait for. I built the settlement work and the medical knowledge and a friendship with Dr. Harrington and the trust of people who had no reason to give it to me. And I built all of that alone from nothing in the corners of a house where I was invisible. And I cannot, her voice held. I will not give any of it up. I will not fold myself back into the shape of the woman who ate breakfast alone and called it patience. That woman is gone. I grieve her sometimes, but I won't go back." Alexander did not speak. He was receiving it with his whole face, every word, and she could see the weight of them landing on him without flinching. "I hear you," he said when she finished. "Do you?" "Every word." He took one step toward her, just one, the same deliberate single step he had taken in the study weeks ago. "And I am not asking you to go back. I am not asking you to be smaller. I am asking—" He stopped. His voice had something in it that she had never heard from him, something undefended and almost frightened. "I am asking to come with you, wherever you're going. The settlement, the study, the medical texts, the middle of the table, all of it. I am asking to be the husband who deserves to walk beside that woman, and I know I haven't been, and I know I am starting from a debt I may spend years repaying." He held her gaze. "But I am asking, directly, with nothing held back. Will you let me try?" The hall held the question. Eleanor stood in it. She let it be there, real and heavy, and asked. Then she said, "Don't make me eat at the end of the table again." He blinked. Then something moved through his face, relief and grief, and the beginning of something new, all arriving at once. "Never again," he said. "I swear it." She nodded. "Then we go to Richmond," she said. "Together. And we fight for the 40 acres. She walked past him toward the staircase. His hand caught hers, not grabbing, not holding her back, just a hand finding another hand and holding on for the length of one breath. She let him hold it. One breath. Then she went upstairs to pack, and she could feel him standing below in the hall, and she could feel the exact weight of what had just been agreed to, and she knew it was not everything, and was not a conclusion, but was the realest beginning this house had ever seen. 10. They arrived in Richmond on Thursday evening, and William Hawthorne Alexander's father, a lean man of 60 with the same jaw as his son and sharper eyes than either of them had anticipated, met them at the hotel and looked at Eleanor for approximately 4 seconds before he took both her hands in his and said without preamble, "You wrote me an honest letter. I am not accustomed to honest letters. Thank you for it. Eleanor said, "Thank you for reading it, sir." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned to Alexander and said with the particular directness of a father who has earned the right to it, "She's remarkable. You almost lost her. Don't do it again." Alexander said, "I know." "Good," William said, and released Eleanor's hands and turned to dinner. She liked him immediately. The meeting at Carver's office was the following morning, Friday, the last week of August, the summer finally breaking into something that threatened distantly to become autumn. Aldgate was already seated when they arrived. A careful man mid-50s with the practiced stillness of a lawyer who has made a career of reading rooms. He looked at Eleanor when she entered, and his eyes did a brief practiced calculation wife peripheral, likely here for appearance, and then he looked away. Eleanor sat down at the table and opened the folio she had brought. He looked back. She had spent 3 evenings preparing. She had written out in her precise, clear hand a timeline of every conversation Alexander had described to her, dates, locations, the language used, the people present. She had cross-referenced it against Virginia property law as she understood it from the texts Carver had lent her, and she had found 3 points where the Fairfax claim was weakest. She had written questions for Carver to ask. She had written a summary that was 4 pages long and entirely free of sentiment. She set it on the table in front of Carver, who looked at it and then at her with an expression that was recalibrating rapidly. "Mrs. Hawthorne prepared the timeline," Alexander said. He said it simply without performance, with the ease of a man who has no need to announce his own contribution because he is comfortable acknowledging someone else's. Carver read 2 pages. He looked at her again. "Did you train in law?" "I read," she said. He turned back to this document. "This is the most organized account I've received from a client in 20 years of practice," he said. Aldgate across the table was reading his own copy of the Fairfax claim with an expression that was working hard not to show what it felt. William Hawthorne sat beside Eleanor and did not say a single unnecessary word, which she appreciated entirely. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By midday, Aldgate had withdrawn the formal claim, not because he had wanted to, because William's testimony laid out in Carver's careful phrasing removed the factual foundation. Because the timeline Eleanor had constructed revealed 3 inconsistencies in the Fairfax account that neither Aldgate nor his clients had anticipated being found. Because Eleanor suspected Aldgate was a good enough lawyer to know when the ground had shifted and the cost of continuing was higher than his client wanted to pay. He gathered his papers without drama. He looked at Eleanor once across the table, and his look was neither hostile nor warm, but was genuinely assessing the look of a man who has been surprised by something and is deciding what to make of it. "Good day, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Good day, Mr. Aldgate," she said. He left. The room exhaled. Carver set down his pen. William looked at the ceiling briefly. Alexander looked at Eleanor. She looked at her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her, perfectly steady. "Well," said William Hawthorne into the silence, "I believe that concludes the morning." They celebrated at dinner, the 3 of them, in the hotel's main dining room with wine that William ordered, and a meal that went on longer than strictly necessary because nobody wanted to be the first to end it. William told stories. He was good at it, the kind of man who had lived long enough to know which details matter and which can be cut, who understood that the best stories move quickly and land hard. He told one about Alexander at 12 years old attempting to build a dam across the North Creek to create a fishing pond, and instead flooding 3 acres of his own family's wheat field. He told it with such specific and loving detail that Eleanor laughed until her eyes watered. Alexander across the table watched her laugh. She felt him watching and did not stop. She had stopped managing herself for his benefit months ago, and she was not going back to it now, not even for the pleasant version, not even when the watching felt like warmth. After dinner, William excused himself early with the frankness of a man who knows when 2 people need to be left alone. He shook Eleanor's hand at the foot of the stairs, held it for a moment and said quietly, so only she could hear, "Come visit in Philadelphia. Bring him. He was happier today than I've seen him in 4 years. "I'll consider it," she said. He smiled the same smile as Alexander's, the unplanned, genuine kind, and went upstairs. She and Alexander sat in the hotel's front sitting room. The city moved outside. The summer's last heat pressed against the windows. She was tired in the way that follows a day of sustained effort, the good kind of tired, the kind with something solid underneath it. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said. She looked at him. "All right. I wrote to Harrington." He held her gaze when she stilled. "I wrote to him 2 weeks ago. I told him that whatever role he had played in this past summer in your life, I was grateful for it. That he had seen something I had failed to see, and that I considered myself in his debt for treating you as a person of worth and capability when you were not being treated that way in your own home." He paused. He wrote back. Eleanor was very quiet. "What did he say?" "He said that you had done the seeing yourself, that he had simply been present." Alexander looked at his hands briefly. "He also said," a pause. "He said that you had mentioned once that most people talked at you, that he had tried to talk with you instead. He said he hoped I would learn the difference." He met her eyes. "I read that sentence 5 times. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something large and complicated, and she was not certain she was going to manage to keep it entirely contained. "He's a good man," she said. "Yes," Alexander said. "He is. And he loves this work more than anything, and you were the best thing that happened to his Thursday rounds this summer, and he told me that directly and without apology." He paused. "I want you to keep going. To the settlement. Thursdays and Tuesdays, and whatever other days you decide it needs. I want to come when I'm useful and stay home when I'm not. I want—" He stopped. "I want to build something with you. Not the thing I thought marriage was, the managed arrangement, the comfortable parallel lives. The real thing. Whatever that costs. However long it takes." Eleanor stood up. He looked up at her, and for a moment, he had the expression of a man who has said everything true he knows and is waiting to learn if it was enough. She extended her hand to him. Not the way she would to a business associate. Not the way she had the night in the study when she'd said, "Show me." This was different, open palm and offering rather than a test. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He stood and took it. They returned to Thornwood on Saturday morning. The fields were golden with the first suggestion of early autumn moving in at the edges of summer. The tenant settlement was visible from the carriage window as they turned up the main road, smoke rising from the Callaway chimney, which meant Ruth was baking, which meant James was probably underfoot and getting flour on everything within reach. Eleanor watched it as they passed and felt in her chest the particular quiet of a person who has found the place they are supposed to be and knows it. The carriage stopped at the front of the house. Thomas appeared from nowhere, as Thomas always did, and held the door and looked between the two of them with the careful face of a young man who has learned to read weather in rooms. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Thank you, Thomas," Eleanor said. She stepped down and turned to look at the house, Thornwood Hall. Her home, the place that had been a beautiful and lonely shell for 11 months, and was now slowly and imperfectly and honestly becoming something else. "Is Mrs. Draper in the kitchen?" "Yes, ma'am." "Tell her we'll have dinner at 6, at the main table." She paused. "Both of us." "Yes, ma'am." He was smiling, she noticed. Not performing a smile, actually smiling, the real version, the kind that a person can't manufacture. "I'll tell her." He went inside. Alexander came to stand beside her. They looked at the house together, the way they had stood on the porch, and watched Margaret's carriage disappear, the same side-by-side orientation, the same shared facing of the same thing. "I want to move your chair," he said. She turned to look at him. "At the table," he said. "I want to move it. Not to the head, not to mark a position, just—" He held her gaze. "To the middle." where it should have been the whole time. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She thought about the long table and the 12 feet and the 11 months of breakfast alone, and Thomas saying the middle of it, I mean with flower pink ears. "It's a dining chair," she said. "It doesn't require a ceremony." "No," he agreed. "But it does require someone to actually move it." She tilted her head slightly. "Then move it." He went inside. She stood alone on this porch for a moment. This woman, who had been invisible in her own home, and had refused to disappear, who had built a life in the margins of a house that didn't see her, and had been seen anyway by a sick child's mother, and a plain-spoken physician, and a father-in-law, who read honest letters, and a husband who had arrived late, and known it, and started anyway. She breathed in the Virginia air, the last of summer in it, the first suggestion of something turning the particular smell of a season that has given everything it had. She went inside. In the dining room, Alexander was setting her chair at the middle of the table. He was doing it carefully, deliberately, with both hands, the way a man handles something he has learned too late to value and is not going to be careless with again. Eleanor watched him from the doorway. He looked up. He found her watching. He did not look away. She crossed the room. She sat down in the chair, her chair in the middle of her table, in the middle of her home, and she looked at her husband across the shorter, honest distance between them, and she said nothing, because nothing needed saying, because some things are only true when they are simply lived. That evening, they ate dinner at 6 o'clock. Two people at the middle of a table that had once swallowed them whole, and they talked about the settlement. About the Philadelphia visit William had proposed for October, about the Henderson girls' recovery, and the north fence that needed work, and a book Eleanor had been reading, and a memory Alexander offered carefully, like a man who has learned the difference between burying the past and honoring it. They talked until the candles were low. Neither of them moved to end it first. Eleanor Hawthorne had come to Thornwood Hall as a name on a household record, invisible in a house full of grief, eating alone at the end of a table long enough to hold 14. She had been patient, and then she had been done being patient. She had built something from nothing. She had learned to hold a child's wrist and count the pulse of a living thing. She had written 4 honest pages to a stranger. She had stood in a study and said the true words without raising her voice and without flinching from what they cost her. She had not waited to be saved. She had walked through the kitchen door on a Thursday morning in August and gone to find the world, and the world had found her back, and she had brought all of it home with her. Every piece of herself she had built in the margins, and the tenant cottages, and the long summer mornings on the settlement path, and she had set it down in the middle of the table, and she had taken her seat, and she had not moved from it. This was her home. These were her people. This was her life, not the one she had been given, not the one she had been told to accept, but the one she had chosen with clear eyes on the other side of the hardest year of her existence. She had not replaced anyone's memory. She had not been replaced. She was Eleanor Hawthorne, whole present scene, and she was exactly where she had decided to be, and no one in this house or any other would ever again make her feel otherwise.